This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
It's time for another retro interview with a celebrity that is no longer with us. This time around, it's a chat I had back in July of 1994. Actor Barry Morse had a career that spanned 7 decades, with more than 3,000 roles on radio, television, stage, and in film. He's probably best known for playing Lieutenant Gerard in the original 1960s hit series The Fugitive, starring David Janssen. And sci-fi fans knew him from his stint on Space 1999 back in the 70s. In 1994, Barry was in Montreal because he was guest starring on a new police drama called Sirens. So he dropped by into studio to chat with us, and he was the most delightful, engaging storyteller you could ever meet. In other words, a joy to be around. Here's part of that conversation now. You're here in town because you're working on an episode of Sirens, which is filming in Montreal, 22 episodes.
Yes.
And so you're back in a city that you've lived in.
Yes, it's a great sentimental journey for me, Peter Anthony, because all those years ago, it's hard to believe, but in 1950, and for a part of 1951, my wife and I, and our then 2 toddler children, lived here in Montreal, out in NDG, and just this morning, because I had a day off from shooting, I was able to make a sentimental journey down there to see if the house that we lived in is still there, and it is. And I was able to take some photographs to take back to my wife and our children to remind them of those very happy times that we had here. But of course, in those days, can you believe it, there was no television. And so whatever public entertainment there was all confined to the radio. And we used to pile into the old CBC studios down there on what was then Dorchester, in the old Ford Hotel. And of course, all the shows were live. And I can remember vividly playing in one soap opera in English, which was called Laura Limited, and another soap opera, God forgive my nerve, in French, called Un homme et son péché. And I didn't really understand much of what I was saying in Quebecois French, but all the Quebecois actors were very kind and helpful and told me how to say things. And it was a very exciting time, because I was lucky enough to have been involved in television right at the very beginning. Now, most people think that television didn't begin until after the war. But in fact, the BBC in England, where I was born, had a public television service going in the latter part of 1935. And nobody who was anybody in our profession wanted to have anything to do with television. Because, can you believe this? It was commonly thought that television could never become a popular entertainment because it was very expensive. So sets cost the equivalent of, in today's terms, the equivalent of $25,000 or $30,000, let's say. And also, you couldn't get any kind of a picture if you lived more than about 2 or 3 miles from the transmitter, which meant that only very rich people living right in the middle of London could actually see the show. And those of us who were youngsters, who were trying to get our feet wet in the performing business, loved the idea of getting into this new medium.
So it's great to get on something on the ground floor, so to speak.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I remember doing a stage play with a quite famous actor of that time, and he heard that I was doing this other thing during the daytime. All the shows were live, of course, in those days, just like you and I are now. And this elder actor said to me, "What is this you're doing during the day, Morse?" And I said, "Oh, it's for the BBC, sir." We always called older actors sir in those days. He said, "Oh, yes, I know. You mean the wireless." The wireless was what people called the radio, of course, in those days. And I said, "Well, no, it's not exactly the wireless, sir. It's like the wireless, but with pictures." "Oh, yes," he said with infinite scorn. He said, "You are a fool to mix yourself up with that sort of twaddle. Don't you realize," he said, "it's just a fad, like the yo-yo. They'll have forgotten all about it by Christmas." That's what people believed, that it was just a rich man's toy that would disappear. And it's amazing to realize that in the short span of time, within my lifetime, It's become one of the most important media on earth.
Mm-hmm.
I was telling this story. I was telling this story to some students not very long ago at the university in Toronto. And somebody said, well, when did you first do television? And I said, well, it actually was in 1936. And they all looked terrified, these students. And I thought, well, I'll make a cheap joke. I'm a great sucker for cheap jokes. I said, yes, that's when television first began. And I should, of course, tell you that in those days, I thought I'm going to get a cheap laugh here. In those days, it was all done by steam. No laugh at all, because they were all writing it down. They thought I was true. I was telling the truth.
Well, you've done so much in your career, and you've done all the mediums. Do you have a preference? I know a lot of times you talk to stage actors and they say stage is where it's at. Do you have a preference?
No. I'm lucky enough to have done and keep doing all of it. Somebody reminded me just the other day, isn't it terrifying, that I've been in this daft trade for 60 years. I call it making faces and pulling faces and making noises for a living. And after you've been at it that length of time, you begin to realize that they're not all that different. What is so different, of course, and what's so fascinating about radio, this thing that we're doing now, is that a great deal is left up to the audience. A great deal is left in what we call the customer's minds. That kind of evocative thing, the way in which somebody speaks, gives an audience an opportunity to fill in the picture for themselves, doesn't it? It isn't actually all spelled out for them. So if I speak in a very deep and menacing tone, they can visualize somebody 8 feet tall who's going to throttle you the next minute. But if, on the other hand, I speak in a little thin, whimpery kind of voice, they can think of some little kind of nebbish fellow whom the wind can blow away. And so I think, in a way, as far as the audience's involvement is concerned, radio is almost the best of them. I still do a lot of radio. Unfortunately, there isn't a great deal of
drama or comedy,
creative radio being done nowadays. But when you think of the marvellous things that were done, I know that you're a great collector and connoisseur of all this marvellous stuff. Your customers may not know. Let me praise you for a moment. Peter Anthony and I were talking just before we came on the air, and I was staggered, being an old geezer, you know, to discover how much of the history and tradition of the whole radio field he knows about. And that's very flattering to those of us who are old geezers.
Let's talk a little bit about the television show, The Fugitive, that you were on.
Oh, yes.
What was it like being, as far as the fans are concerned, who obviously knew Mr. Kimball was innocent, being so wrong for so many years and hell-bent on proving?
Well, very encouraging. In fact, I was immensely flattered, and I still am, to find that the whole world, really, was so much involved, so much engrossed in this series, and took it so deeply seriously, that I was forever being attacked by little old ladies in airports saying, "You rotten mean man, why don't you leave that nice Dr. Kimball alone?" And then and tough guys, you know, in restaurants or bars say, "You dumb copper, don't you understand? He didn't know." And they take it all very, very seriously. And so when that happened, I learned that I could take refuge in the fact that I, as you can tell, I don't talk exactly like Lieutenant Gerard used to talk. And so I would say, no, you think I'm that chap on television? Oh, no, I'm sorry, you're wrong. I'm a professor of English at Yale, or I make up some story. Because, of course, it's the ultimate compliment when people take it all so seriously that they think it really is happening, even to this day. I always know when some new, perhaps third world country is starting to have a television service and starting to show the old Fugitive, because I start to get hate mail in pidgin English, you know, from Central Africa or somewhere, and people writing and saying, "Oh, why you not leave that nice man alone, you rotten fellow?" And it's a compliment, really, I suppose, because in those days, of course, this is the interesting thing about that series. It was so brilliantly written, of course, and that's the best part of it all. But in those days, there had not been a character like, who was the fellow who got killed on that?
David...
oh, no, not our hero. I mean, on another series later on, there was a kind of villain. Oh, gosh, I know the chap who played it. But anyway, in those days when we were doing the Fugitive, which is more than 30 years ago...
There wasn't sort of anti-hero.
That's right. Most characters that appeared in television series were adorable, almost emetically adorable, because the sponsors who backed the shows didn't want to have anybody unpleasant associated with their deodorant or motor car or whatever it was. And so it was quite a switch to have a continuing character who was deliberately designed to be upsetting. And a lot of Hollywood actors wouldn't have wanted to do it, because a lot of Hollywood actors in those days only liked playing kind of adorable parts. Well, of course, I know, and I'm sure you know, that most of the best parts to be played are the ones that are less than entirely virtuous. They're always much more interesting.
And there isn't anything such thing as a good hero without a good villain.
That's right. And when we made the pilot for that old Fugitive series, it was shown, sampled around to sample audiences, and they got back to our producer, dear Quinn Martin, and people said, well, they love David Jansen, the hero, but boy, they hate that Barry Morse. You've got to get rid of him. And so Quinn would say, no, that's the whole idea. And the character I'm thinking of in the later series had initials. He was called not DJ, but TK or something like that.
Thomas Ewart Edward Cat. T.H.E. Cat?
No.
Robert Loggia?
No, never mind. No.
Okay.
But in those days, it was a new breakthrough, really, to have a continuing character who was meant to be disliked. And, of course, the flattering thing was that everybody always assumed that I was an American.
Oh, you're not talking about Dallas and J.R., are you?
That's what I...
Okay, there you go.
Yes, I knew we'd get it. Well done. Thank you, Peter Anstey. Yeah, so it was, in its way, a kind of novelty. And the wonderful thing, the very rewarding thing, is that all over the world now, wherever I go, I run into young people who were not even born when we started to do that series, but who appreciate it and like it more than most of the new series that are on, which doesn't say much for the new series.
That was part of an interview with Barry Morse from July 1994. I could have talked to that man all night. He was a warm and kind gentleman, and the kind of person who could capture your attention with his animated joy for telling a story. Barry died on February 2nd, 2008, at University College London Hospital at the age of 89 from undisclosed causes. His body was donated to medical science.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuph is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.